When we look at a map of eastern Ukraine or watch footage of drone strikes flashing across our screens, it is easy to get lost in the sheer chaos of it all. We see trenches, burning oil depots, and grain ships navigating contested waters. But beneath the smoke and the noise lies a deeply structured, almost mathematical game of survival, leverage, and raw strategy. What if we stripped away the daily headlines and looked at this conflict through the cold, analytical lens of corporate strategy and military intelligence?
That is exactly how the planners on both sides are looking at it. To make sense of a war that seems to have no end in sight, we have to look past the immediate tactical wins and losses and examine the underlying machinery. We are talking about strategic alignment, resource constraints, and the brutal logic of game theory. When you lay these frameworks over the current map of the conflict, the chaotic headlines suddenly start to form a very clear, albeit tragic, picture.
Let us start with how these high-level goals are actually set. If we use the MOST framework, looking at mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics, how do the two sides stack up? Because on the surface, their missions could not be more polarized.
Exactly. For Ukraine, the mission is absolute sovereignty and existential survival. Their objectives are to reclaim occupied territory, secure ironclad Western security guarantees, and cripple Russia's economic capacity to wage war. Their strategy is asymmetric warfare, using low-cost technology to offset Russia's massive industrial advantage. And the tactics? That is where we see the relentless drone strikes on Russian oil refineries, the targeting of the Black Sea Fleet, and the holding actions along the Eastern Front.
And on the Russian side, the mission is fundamentally different. It is about regional hegemony, halting NATO expansion, and asserting control over what they view as their historical sphere of influence. Their objectives are to exhaust Ukrainian forces, fracture Western political will, and secure their hold on the annexed territories. Their strategy is a war of attrition, leveraging their vast reserves of manpower and material. Tactically, they rely on heavy artillery grinds in the east and massive coordinated missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure.
What is fascinating is how this feeds directly into a SWOT analysis. If we look at the internal strengths and weaknesses of both sides, alongside external opportunities and threats, we see a striking asymmetry. Ukraine's greatest strength is its technological agility and decentralized innovation. They have essentially turned off-the-shelf consumer drones into precision-guided weapons. But their glaring weakness is a near-total dependence on external Western aid and a smaller mobilization pool compared to Russia.
While for Russia, their strength lies in sheer mass industrial capacity, oil revenue, and a centralized command that can absorb immense losses. Yet, their weakness is a rigid military hierarchy, economic isolation, and a vulnerability to asymmetric strikes deep within their own borders, like the recent drone campaigns targeting the Moscow region.
Yes, and those vulnerabilities open up massive opportunities for Ukraine. By targeting Russian energy infrastructure, Ukraine is not just hitting military targets. They are striking at the very lifeblood of the Russian economy. But the threat of a wider escalation or a sudden drop in Western political support always looms over Kiev. Meanwhile, Moscow's opportunity lies in exploiting political divisions in the West, while their threat is the long-term degradation of their domestic economy and the potential for internal instability if the war drags on indefinitely.
This economic and political dimension brings us right to the Pestel framework. When we analyze the macro-environmental factors, political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal, the global ripple effects of this war are staggering. Economically, we are seeing a complete reshaping of global energy and food markets. The mutual airstrikes on energy infrastructure and the constant tension surrounding grain exports in the Black and Azov Seas have triggered massive volatility.
It is a global game of leverage. When Ukraine successfully targets Russian oil refineries, they are trying to restrict Russia's domestic fuel supply and hit their export revenues. But that also sends jitters through global oil markets, which worries Western allies who are sensitive to inflation. On the flip side, the battle over the grain corridor is a social and political lever. Blocking Ukrainian grain exports does not just hurt Ukraine's economy. It threatens food security in parts of Africa and the Middle East, using global hunger as geopolitical leverage.
It is incredibly complex, and technologically, we are witnessing the world's first true drone war, where artificial intelligence and electronic warfare are evolving on a weekly basis. Environmentally, the destruction of energy facilities and industrial sites is causing long-term ecological damage that will take decades to remediate. Legally, the conflict continues to challenge the very foundations of international law and sovereignty.
To look at this through an intelligence lens, we can also apply the SPEAR framework, focusing on security, politics, economics, advocacy, and reconnaissance. The security landscape of Europe has been permanently altered. Politically, alliances are hardening, with NATO expanding and Russia drawing closer to partners like Iran and North Korea for military supplies. Economically, the sanctions regime has forced a massive decoupling of Russia from the Western financial system.
And the reconnaissance aspect is unprecedented. The integration of commercial satellite imagery, open source intelligence, and real-time battlefield data has made this the most transparent war in human history. There is simply nowhere to hide on the modern battlefield.
Which makes you realize how vital it is to have a deep, nuanced understanding of these massive global shifts. It is not just about the front lines. It is about how all these pieces fit together.
Absolutely. And speaking of keeping up with these complex, fast-moving global dynamics, it is the perfect time to remind our listeners about what we do here. If you are enjoying this deep dive, you should know that this is exactly what we strive for every single week on our podcast, The New Sentinel.
That is right. The New Sentinel is entirely dedicated to providing these kinds of in-depth discussions and deep dives into an incredibly wide array of topics. We do not just stop at global security and military strategy. We span the entire spectrum, from the strategic intricacies of military operations all the way to the glitz, glamour, and cultural shifts of modern pop culture.
We thoughtfully craft every single episode to make sure you walk away with a comprehensive, multidimensional understanding of the subject. We bring in expert analysis, conduct detailed breakdowns, and focus heavily on engaging storytelling so that even the most complex topics feel accessible and compelling.
So, whether you are a pop culture enthusiast looking to understand the trends shaping our world, or someone with a keen interest in global security and geopolitics, the New Sentinel has something tailored just for you. We want to invite you to tune in, view, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments to stay both informed and entertained.
And for the entrepreneurs and business owners listening in, if you have a product or a service that aligns with an audience that values depth, intelligence, and high-quality content, we can help you advertise. Partnering with us is a great way to reach a highly engaged, thoughtful community. But now let us get back to the board state of this conflict, because this is where things get truly fascinating from a mathematical perspective.
Yes, let us talk about game theory. When you look at the decisions being made in Kyiv and Moscow, they are not just reacting. They are playing a high-stakes, iterative game. Specifically, We are looking at a classic war of attrition model, combined with elements of the prisoner's dilemma.
In a standard war of attrition, two players compete for a resource by bearing escalating costs over time. The player who outlasts the other wins, but the tragedy of the game is that the costs incurred by both sides can easily exceed the value of the prize itself.
Exactly. Each day, the war continues. The cumulative cost in lives, infrastructure, and economic stability grows for both Russia and Ukraine. Yet, neither side wants to back down first, because doing so means conceding defeat and accepting all the accumulated losses for zero reward. From a game theory perspective, this creates a devastating Nash equilibrium, where both players continue to fight, even though the optimal outcome for both would have been to avoid the conflict entirely.
And the reason they cannot reach that cooperative outcome brings us to the credible commitment problem, a core concept in game theory. For any peace negotiation or ceasefire to work, both sides must believe that the other will adhere to the agreement in the future. But right now, there is zero trust. Ukraine fears that any pause in fighting will simply allow Russia to rearm and launch a more effective offensive later. Russia believes that any concession will be used by Ukraine and the West to further integrate Ukraine into the Western security architecture.
So, instead of cooperating, both sides choose the dominant strategy of continued conflict. Ukraine seeks to change Russia's payoff matrix by raising the cost of their occupation, by launching drone strikes on Russian soil, hitting energy infrastructure, and threatening their maritime logistics in the Black Sea. Ukraine is trying to make the cost of continuing the war higher than the cost of withdrawing for Russia.
While Russia is doing the exact same thing to Ukraine and its Western allies, by grinding down the Ukrainian military on the Eastern Front, targeting their power grid to make winters unlivable, and disrupting grain exports, Russia is trying to force Ukraine to the realization that the cost of continued resistance is too high to bear. It is a brutal, calculated attempt to force the opponent to yield.
What this tells us is that this war will not end because of a sudden change of heart. It will end when the mathematical reality of the payoff matrix changes for one or both players. Either the costs of fighting become genuinely unsustainable, or one side gains a technological or strategic breakthrough that fundamentally alters the balance of power.
It is a sobering realization. When we look at the future, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for the global order? If the ultimate lesson of this conflict is that raw attrition and economic endurance are the deciding factors in modern warfare, we are looking at a much more unstable, heavily armed world.
We are indeed. It suggests that the post-Cold War era of rapid, high-tech, decisive interventions is giving way to a resurgence of industrial-scale warfare. A world where nations must once again secure their supply chains, build massive stockpiles of basic munitions, and prepare for prolonged, multi-domain conflicts. It forces us to reflect on whether our international institutions are truly capable of preventing these escalatory spirals, or if we are locked into a systemic cycle where power and leverage are the only currencies that truly matter.
It leaves us with a profound question to ponder. As the lines between military strategy, economic warfare, and technological innovation continue to blur, how do we build a global framework that can break these destructive loops of game theory before they begin? The answers we find in the coming years will shape the geopolitical landscape, not just for Europe, but for the entire globe, for generations to come. Thank you for walking through this complex chessboard with us today. And to everyone listening, we look forward to continuing these deep conversations next time.